What I'll try to do is, first I'll say a few things about the concept of modernity, conceptualized in structural rather than cultural terms. Then I'll try to link modernity with nationalism. And the third part of the paper discusses some points, criticisms of Gellner's theory. Now, concerning the definition of modernity, I define it as a social organization which became dominant after the French and the Industrial Revolution, and it entails a massive, unprecedented mobilization and inclusion of the population to the national center, and it has two basic features. From an agency point of view, one major feature, unique feature, is the deep, unmediated state penetration of the periphery. And from a systemic point of view, the second unique characteristic is a top-down differentiation of institutional spheres. Now, a few words about the first, deep, unmediated state penetration of the periphery. This points to a mode of domination where you have new technologies which enable state elites to expand their administration to the periphery in a way which was not possible in pre-modern situations. In other terms, you have a situation where as Mickman says, the infrastructural powers of the state are really extraordinary in the sense that in pre-modern societies, however despotic a regime, you could never somehow have this type of penetration. Now, as far as the relations of domination is concerned, what we see is a shift, a massive shift of material resources from the periphery to the center, and therefore you have the concentration not only of the means of production but also of the means of domination at the top. And of course you have also a shift of symbolic resources from the periphery to the center, and therefore a concentration of what one can call the means of persuasion at the top. A final feature of the relations of domination is that this type of very deep penetration is unmediated in the sense that the linkages between rulers and ruled are not mediated via feudal or patrimonial groupings. Now, if we try to link this type of feature, structural feature of modernity, with nationalism, I would define nationalism from an action perspective. Nationalism can be seen as a discourse by subjects trying for a variety of instrumental or non-instrumental reasons to promote, consolidate, legitimize a mode of domination characterized by deep, unmediated state penetration of the periphery and by an overall shift of material and symbolic resources from the periphery to the center. I'll try to make this more clear by using an example from Greek nationalism. At the beginning of the 19th century, during pre-independence time, you have in Greece a struggle between westernizing elites, diaspora merchants, intellectuals influenced by the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, Western educated professionals who wanted somehow, first of all, to get their independence from the Ottoman Empire, but also to construct a mode of domination like the one that I have defined, in the sense that they were for a centralized state and with a concentration of the means of domination and persuasion at the top. And against them you had various autochthonous elites, notables, landowners, military chieftains, bandits, freedom fighters, who wanted to maintain the Ottoman system of domination, but without the Turks. They wanted somehow to retain the privileges that they had and gain also the privileges that the Turks were enjoying. And therefore, this struggle finally was settled by the victory of the westernized elites, which victory was partly explained by the fact that they had the support of foreign powers. If we now go to the post-independence period after 1821, what we see here again is the development and the consolidation of the centralized state and the resistance of local anti-Western elites to the centralizing tendencies of the state. Therefore, during the whole of the 19th century, we have local revolts against the centralized state in an attempt to stop centralization. Finally, when centralization became irreversible and the local elites realized that, they gave up resisting in this way and they tried to colonize the state from within. So this about the first feature of modernity, deep unmediated penetration. Now the second feature of modernity is top-down differentiation, i.e. the differentiation of institutional spheres, each sphere portraying at least potentially its own logics and values. Now, of course, differentiation is not a feature of modernity, or only you have complex pre-modern societies which were highly differentiated, but in the pre-modern context, differentiation usually stopped at the top. You had a differentiated top at the segmental base. Like, for instance, when Marx describes the Asiatic mode of production, he gives us exactly this picture. Now, once you have top-down differentiation, then, as Parsons would say, you have the problem of integration, of how you integrate the differentiated parts. For Parsons, in modern societies, this happens more or less automatically. You have an equilibrium between the economic sphere, the political sphere, the cultural, the social sphere. I think he's wrong, because usually integration takes place by the dominance of one sphere over the others. And I would say that in early modernity, you have the dominance of the political. And in that I would agree with Tilly and Michael Mann in the sense that the motor force bringing about modernity was less market expansion and more state expansion which had to do with interstate struggles, particularly during the Napoleonic Wars, where states had to extract much more resources in order to finance citizens' armies and so forth. Therefore, in other terms, the major mechanisms of integration in early modernity were more political rather than economic. Therefore, from this point of view, if we try now to link again this structural feature with nationalism, I would say that from a systemic differentiation or functionalist point of view, if you like, nationalism is one of the main mechanisms integrating the differentiated institutional spheres of modernity, differentiation achieved or to be achieved. Now, Gellner makes a similar point, a functionalist, systemic point, when he says that with industrial society you have role differentiation, roles are much more flexible, they're not as rigid as in simple societies, and therefore culture becomes much more important for coordinating the parts or communicating with each other than in simple societies. Now it seems to me a more theoretically sort of sophisticated way of doing this is to follow Parsons, who after all is the major theorist about differentiation and modernity, with a lot of weaknesses of course, but anyway, where he talks about role differentiation, a requirement of integration, value generalization. In other terms, when roles get differentiated, in order to coordinate them, you must have more generalized values. And this, when and if it is achieved, you have greater adaptive capacity. I don't want to get into Parsonian theory, but it fits quite well, again, my Greek example, in the sense that the pre-independence period, you have a diffusion between the religious and political roles and educational roles, in the sense that the patriarch was both the political and the religious representative vis-à-vis the Ottoman center, vis-à-vis the port. With the establishment of the Greek state, you have a very clear differentiation in the sense that, for instance, the educational function are taken away from the church and are performed by specialized institutions controlled by the Ministry of Education. Judicial functions, the same thing, they're taken away from the church, and you have the Ministry of Justice, with the reaction, of course, from religious elites who don't like this, but they have to give in. And in that sense, one can argue that in the post-independence time, when modernity sort of comes in, you have nationalism as a more context-free, more generalized mechanism of integration, which takes the form of a Whig type of history of the unbroken continuity, glorious continuity between ancient Greece, Byzantium, and modern Greece. Now, how much more?
You're doing fine. You have 13 minutes.
I have 13 minutes.
Oh, it would be 5 then, right? Sorry? It's 12:40. And there's 10.
Keep talking. 10 minutes.
10 minutes? 12 and a half.
Okay. So, now if we take these two features, penetration and differentiation, we can build up a fourfold typology. When both features are very accentuated, you have a nationalism, let's say French nationalism. If penetration and differentiation is very low, we come to the type of nationalism that John referred to in West Africa, where the state does not reach the periphery, and where very often you have strong segmentalism, and therefore you cannot really talk about a nation state, really. It's just, you cannot talk, it seems to me, at all of nationalism. And then in between you have two other boxes, one where you have penetration but not very advanced differentiation, let's say Iranian nationalism. And the last box, which is rather rare, is when you have full differentiation but not great penetration, and then I would put confederal polities like Switzerland, for instance, where the parts have a lot of autonomy and the centralized state is rather weak. Now, coming to Gellner's theory, it seems to me that these two features that I mentioned cope much better with the difficulties of Gellner's theory rather than the two features mentioned by John, industrialization and cultural homogeneity. Industrialization, as already John said, it's not only Greece, it's not just the Balkans where you have state expansion and development before industrialization, but it is also Latin America, for instance. Many semi-peripheral, late developing countries, you have the expansion of the state before industrialization. To give you just a small idea, for instance, in Greece, and you had in 1870s, the number of civil servants per 10,000 population were 7 times more in Greece than in the United Kingdom. So you realize the enormous size of the state, of the armies, etc., before the development of industrialization, which starts in the 50s and 40s, 1950s, 40s. Now, about cultural homogeneity, there I would disagree with John in the sense that Gellner's theory is not that somehow when he talks about cultural homogenization, he doesn't mean that you have a dominant culture articulated with peripheral cultures. He doesn't, because if he means it like this, always in all polities there is usually a dominant culture, national culture, and peripheral cultures. But also I think he goes a step further and he says with nationalism, what is the elective affinity is either to have one culture, one polity, or if you have many cultures, then there is a tendency for the elimination of pluralism. Whereas it seems to me you can find many cases where you can have different cultures with one dominant without that tendency. In other terms, you have polities where you have a stabilization of a system of a dominant culture and different other cultures, ethnic or national. From Switzerland to Canada that you mentioned, to Belgium, to Greece now with the Albanians in Greece, you have always small disruptions, etc. But the tendency for the elimination of pluralism by violent means or other means is not very strong. Therefore, if one replaces industrialization and cultural homogeneity with state penetration and differentiation, it seems to me you have fewer exceptions. And in that sense, it makes the theory of nationalism more stronger, although I would agree with you that I don't think you can have a universal theory of nationalism, not only for the reasons that you mentioned, but also you cannot have a universal theory in the social science of anything. Revolution, family, whatever you think, universal theories, they are either wrong, in the sense that are only valid under certain conditions which you don't measure them if you are universal, or they are trivial. I mean, we have a lot of trivial theories in the social science, but I don't know of any theory which is not trivial and which is universal, i.e. contextless, you know, which is valid irrespective of cultural and historical context. Now, another point that I would like to mention is functionalism. I support Gellner on functionalism. He stressed it many times that he doesn't, when his theory is not teleologically functionalist. In other terms, he doesn't turn needs into causes, which of course is methodologically wrong. But if you use functionalism in a non-teleological way, I think it's very difficult not to do it. Nowadays, people simply don't use the term, but they use functionalism all the time. I mean, institutional analysis, to take Giddens, for instance, is functionalist analysis, is to see things, as Habermas would say, from an externalist point of view. And therefore, if you don't do that and you only see things from the point of view of actors, you miss quite a lot, for me. And therefore, there I support Gellner fully, and I don't think it's a weakness of his theory, that it is functionalist as well as action-oriented. It is both. The last point I would like to make is about the debate primordialism versus constructionism. Again, I think Gellner is absolutely right, because as he said himself, the point is not if you have cultural continuity or discontinuity. This is irrelevant. The point is that even when you have cultural continuity, the cultural elements are constructed in a context which is different, radically different from pre-modern situations. For instance, let's say, to take again my Greek example, if you take Greek peasants in the 19th century, middle of the 19th, or even end of the 19th century, the fact that the linkage they had with the centralized state were weak, and therefore you had only, let's say, very few linkages of, during the time period of taxation and so forth. And you have, at that time, their identity was primarily local rather than national. Whereas later, where the linkages between the centralized state and the peasant multiply and become very strong via the school, via the army, via the post office, etc., then obviously you have a transition to a national identity. But this transition has nothing to do with the cultural content. It is simply a different structural situation. That's it.
Excellent.
Very good.